All right, guys, thanks for joining. Today we are going to go through new training class, a train-the-trainer session on the new training class for Urbancode Deploy. We have Joanne Schooler starting the session off. She is a curriculum architect of DevOps and continuous engineering. And Steve Coutinho will follow. He's a senior consultant in the field who has been getting Urbancode Deploy in on customer sites and giving workshops and help build this training class as well. So, Joanne, I will give the floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So like Lou said, this is actually a train-the-trainer to introduce you to a new course I've been working on for the past couple months, and it is an introduction to Urbancode Deploy. The course title is Essentials of IBM Urbancode Deploy. And basically what we're going to do today is we are going to run through Module 0 and Module 1 of the course. Okay, so in Module 0, we basically give an overview of the course, okay? And I'm going to do that part, so I'm going to give you the course overview. And then Steve is going to take over, and he's going to present Module 1, which is the Urbancode Deploy product overview, okay? So if you are here today, it's probably because you're either going to be teaching the course and you want to learn about the course so you can teach it, or maybe you're new to Urbancode Deploy, so you want to find out about the product. In that case, the product overview part that Steve's going to do is going to be very useful to you because you'll get a nice introduction to the product. So we're going to present this as if we're teaching a class, okay? So we're going to present the material as if this is a regular Essentials of IBM Urbancode Deploy class that's being delivered, okay? Now the course code is QQ147. And that is also used by our training partners so that they can locate the course materials that are found in our course material vault. That's where we put the final course materials. They'll also be on the Urbancode Release and Deploy Learning Circle, and I've already started posting the material there. Okay, so let's get started with the course overview. The primary audience for this course would be users of IBM Urbancode Deploy, configurators, producers, and administrators. Okay, so there's some overlap in the tasks that these people would do. There are some unique tasks to some of the roles, but these are the roles that our Urbancode Deploy design team has identified as users of the product. So the administrators, they might do stuff like install the product and do security type of things. And some of that stuff is covered in the course. Okay? So that's why we list them as a secondary audience here. As I mentioned, this is an introductory course to Urbancode Deploy. So if you complete this course, you're going to know a number of different things. You're going to get a lot of information. You're going to be able to do a lot of different things. So you're going to be able to complete a set of tasks, pretty much the essential things that you need to do with Urbancode Deploy. So just to give you some background on this, there is slide presentation in the course and there is lab work in the course. We start out in the slides talking about how Urbancode Deploy solves customer problems. That's something Steve's going to talk about. We'll talk about the workflow for a simple project. We'll go over that as well in the product overview. We're going to talk about the key concepts and terms like component, resource, processes, and how you use these in the product. We'll show how resources are organized and accessed. You do some lab work with resources. And basically, the key thing about Urbancode Deploy is that you're going to orchestrate deployments to different environments. And you do that in this course. You use the UAT and the SIT environment. So after completing the class, you'll be able to do these things: create a resource, add agents to the base resource, add a base resource to an application environment, add component resources to the agents in the resource tree, create components, import artifacts from a build to create component versions, and we'll look at components and their properties and component processes and add them to components. A couple other things you do, like create an application and an environment. An application process you create, you update an application, approve deployments, and then these other tasks. So there's quite a bit that you do in this full course. Of course, we're not going to do all of this today. There are a number of different materials for this course. There are slides. There's a lab workbook. That's for the hands-on piece. There's a student workbook, which is basically a PDF of the slides. There's lab environment setup instructions. There's also videos. Now, the lab environment setup instructions were developed so that this could be, the lab environment could be on a cloud, okay, with Linux as the operating system. And that's how they were written. And basically, we provide these lab setup instructions to anybody who's going to prepare the environment to deliver a class, okay, whether that's us or a training partner. Okay, so you can go to a cloud provider like Cloud One if you want. You could come to us if you want, if you have a SoftLayer account, and set up the lab environment for the class with the setup instructions. Now, the student books, the student workbook and the lab workbook, we provide PDFs. Those could be run as soft copy in a class, or you can get them printed by the printer. And the videos are kind of complementary. If you're an instructor presenting the class, you can show the videos if you like. And that's kind of an optional thing. So the course is modular, and there are 6 modules as noted here. We're presenting Module 0 and Module 1 today. And in each module there are slides and labs. One lab, one set of slides for each module. Now, the labs are written sequentially. So when you do the labs, you do need to do the resources lab first, components lab second, applications lab third, and so on. There's no lab for the product overview section module. And the slides, normally you would present the slides for each module before you do the lab. There's a little bit more flexibility in the slides, so if you are short on time, you don't want to present the slides, it's probably going to be okay. If you wanted to present the slides a little bit out of order, you know, that's a possibility. Okay. So now we're going into Module 1 here, which is the product overview. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve at this point, and he's going to present the product overview.
Okay, thanks, Joanne. So in this product overview in Module 1, what we want to cover is to talk about, what is the problems that are being solved, the problems that customers have, the typical challenges they have for deployments, and then introduce Urbancode Deploy and then talk about its key terminology. We'll talk about the workflow, and we'll explore the user interface. Give me the next slide. Slide's not changing. Okay. So in this module, we'll talk about the typical problems we see in deployments and how Urbancode Deploy helps solve those problems. We'll talk about the basic workflow to set up for deployment. Let's talk briefly about the overview of snapshots and inventory and the key terminology and the model itself, the application model itself in Urbancode Deploy. Go over user navigation, talk about just briefly about the deployment topology, so I have that overview, and talk about how the server and the agent communications work in Urbancode Deploy. Next. So this first few slides here just introduce, what are the typical challenges that we have that enterprises have in doing deployments. And a lot of it we see with manual process. We see that a lot. I've gone to a number of customer sites that are doing their deployments manually. We see that. Or I've been to sites where the customers say in the development side get things done because in the agile development, they're using agile methodologies. They get things done quickly, and now the operations are kind of backed up. And then also when you have multiple applications you're deploying, there's usually, or upgrading particular environments. You have multiple people involved with that, multiple configurations, and managing that. So those are the basic challenges we see, and there's an impact on those challenges that in the news over the last couple of years you've read. A lot of them is because of misconfiguration of deployment issues. Next slide. These slides are running slow.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys, well, I stepped away for a second. Do you need me to share your latest tech, Steve? I had stepped away for 1 second, came back, you were presenting.
Oh.
But you're okay.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say next since I don't have access to the slides. So.
Yeah. So I have your latest tech. Do you need that latest tech, or is it okay with Joanne doing?
We can just do it with this one. It's fine. I'll just explain it on the slide. There'll be an update, 12.3 update. So basically, there's the kind of 4 different areas we see challenges. Is we see first off, there's when development's doing work and they're testing things out in development. When they actually go to production, since they've done their tests in development, they haven't done a production-like environment. We see there's issues there. That's one cause of failure in deployments. Another area is, as I mentioned, is there's market pressures to go to release. So the development team may be doing agile development, and then they're relying on, say, the operations side to do those deployments, and they may get backed up. I went to one customer that was, their operations folks were working almost every weekend because the development group had taken on doing an agile and producing their builds more quickly. And the operations folks weren't set up to do those deployments at that time. So that's a typical thing that I see in customers, challenges. Another one is a manual process. We see that a lot. Right now I'm finding with this enterprise I'm at the UK right now, and I'm working with a customer, and we're seeing that in doing our discovery calls right now. Or there's a particular group of people, a person knows how to do the deployments, and you find out, who did the last. There's that lack of repeatability. So that's another challenge. And then doing releases where it may take days and so forth to do the release, and automating it is really what needs to be done. Or they do a spreadsheet, and that's really more, that last column is more, we're not going to talk about it, but in this particular module that talks about code release, that comes in. Next slide. You can just tap to these. So this is just going to go through a common set of problems. There's manual handoffs between development and operations. There's disconnected environments between development and, say, operations, for example. There's lack of repeatability. Basically, the things I just talked about earlier, cost delays, just showing some of the various problems of deployments that you're trying to solve. So, and then next slide. So, Urbancode Deploy is a solution to help automate that process and automate this framework that allows us to consistently do the deployments so that we can do the application deployments and we can do rollbacks. We could also add other types of processes. We may do automated testing as part of that. You can use it for that also. It's orchestration of those changes on the servers and the different tiers of the application. So when you think of a deployment, it's centered around the application. So that application deployment may involve at the application would be, say, WAR files or jar files for, WebSphere or WAS or, Tomcat, JBoss, those type of applications. It could be message queue type things, data power. It could be other types of artifacts that get deployed for those servers and those different application tiers. And there's also Urbancode Deploy solves the issue as far as who can deploy to what environments. This is security around, for example, if you have a dev, UAT staging and production, and each one of those, as you go up the higher level environments, you may have to have security as far as what role is allowed to deploy to those. So provides for that. The solution also provides for that. Then also this visibility, you can get in to see, what's deployed where and who actually deployed, who made those changes. And especially comes in places for insurance companies and regulated type environments where there's audits that are required. That visibility is really important. And then it also provides the ability for the integration of different middleware or provisioning and service virtualization through the use of what's called plugins. Next slide.
Hey Steve, you're breaking up a little bit at times, and at times coming through clear. So it may be the international connection, but I'm not sure if you're.
I'll try to speak up and see. Is it breaking, or is it just?
It seems to be breaking a little bit, yeah. But if you, the best you can do is if you make sure you're talking into the mic.
Okay, I just moved the mic right to my mouth, so hopefully this will show that. So from IBM's perspective, when we talk about DevOps, the DevOps architecture, we're talking about an enterprise capability for continuous software delivery that will help our clients move across to seize market opportunities in terms of reducing time and also customer feedback. So we want to accelerate the software delivery, we want to balance that speed, and we want to reduce the time to customers' feedback. And there's 3 areas we look at. So we're going to talk more about the tool in this module, but I just want to highlight that it's not just the tool when you're talking about deploying. There's other things involved, both in the culture, the people, and then the process. And there's 4 areas that we look at in looking at DevOps across the whole application lifecycle. So we look at steer, dev, test, deploy, and operate. Those are kind of the adoption paths. We're going to focus mostly on the deploy here. Now, one thing that we're going to add to the slide, that there's actually an assessment, a self-assessment your customers can take, and this is a nice kind of thing that you can use for the course for the people you're teaching. They can take a self-assessment and see where they fall in the maturity model for each one of those adoption paths and what areas they want to focus on. And so I'll have a slide that will have that, the links to the self-assessment that's out on the IBM site, along with an explanation of that self-assessment. So that'll be in addition to the slide. Next slide. So the Urbancode Deploy focus in the area of the DevOps process is mostly in the dev test or the deploy side, in those 2 adoption paths. Okay. So the primary focus of using the deploy tool. Next slide. So now let's start to get into some of the terminology as high level. So what is a deployment? It's a process of completing some action by selecting a set of versions from a repository, copying those component versions over to one or more targets, such as, for example, a web server or a database server, and then completing the tasks that are required to actually deploy it, whether you're stopping the web server, copying the files to particular web directory, say for Tomcat, for instance, and then restarting the web server, for example. So, next slide. So, for Urbancode Deploy, the deployment is the process of moving that software moving it from one, say for dev environment, a UAT environment, all the way through production. And there's, it's the what, the how, and the where. What referring to those deployable items, whether they're binary files, they may be web content, they may be middleware updates, updates like JVM settings on WAS. They could be database changes, SQL, or other configurations. Okay. Anything associated with that software that you want to deliver to those targets. The how is referring to those, the how it's going to be deployed, the deployable items through some process, the component process. And the where refers to the target host environment. Okay, next slide. Now this next slide, the model-driven deployment model for Urbancode Deploy is basically set the what, the where, and the how, and let's kind of go through each one of these to kind of sink in for the audience so they understand the main pieces of the product. So we have components, which is the what, the reusable workflows, that process flow is the how, and the where is the environment it's going to. Next slide. And the next couple of slides just kind of reiterate those concepts. So the what being the components, so the individual components are made up of, so you could have a set for an application, for example, of binaries and database schemas and configuration. And the application is a collection of those components and the process that deploys in which order to deploy those particular components. So that's the what. Next slide. And the where is going to be, what environments we're going to go to, and you have and the one thing about Urbancode Deploy is when you build your set of artifacts you're going to deploy, say it's a WAR file, you'll build it independent of what environment it goes to, and then it'll go ahead and resolve at deployment time the properties that are associated with that environment. So when we go to the SIT environment, which have one, say it has one machine where it's the next environment may have 2 machines, a database server, web server, and the production may have 4 machines. And those components will be deployed to those machines. Next slide. The how would be the process. Now there's 2 levels of process in Urbancode Deploy. There's the application process level, which orchestrates that deployment of those components. Okay, and kind of represents the deployment time dependencies. And then there's the fourth component process, which is the one that actually knows how to, the workflow that actually will copy the files over, download them from the repository, copy them over, and off the certain example, in this case here, WebSphere. So that's the component process is the one that actually knows is specific to the technology it's deploying to the platform. Okay. And that's the how. And there's a drag and drop workflow editor, designer, and which controls the execution and creating the various custom steps. Next slide. And you can just tap through these, but this is just basically showing what, put it all together, continuous delivery. We're going to go ahead and build, say your build environment, whether it's Jenkins or RTC or some other build environment. It's going to push the artifacts, instead of whether it's a set of web content or a jar file, a WAR file, into Urbancode's repository called CodeStation. And then from there, it's going to deploy to the different environments. So say, for example, if it's done with a development environment, you may require some tests. They have to pass, some gates have to be put in place before, and then you run those tests, and if they pass, then you're going to create it with a snapshot, which is, we'll talk about snapshots in a minute, but it's a collection of those various versions of those items. Once that's done, then you want to deploy that or promote that to the different environments. You can tap that one more time there around blue. I'm sorry, yeah. And then you may have manual sign-off, so there's ability to have an approval process of Urbancode Deploy. Also, there's also notification capabilities in Urbancode Deploy. So when that manual process, then if it's approved, then it would actually allow you to deploy to the production environment. Okay.
Hey, Steve, I'm going to do a mute all, so we're getting some noise on the wall. Before
Sure.
I do, there is a question about, you may want to cover it in the coming slides. Do we have support for secure role-based deployment?
You have support for secure role-based deployment? Yes, we do have roles, and it's built into the product. They're going to talk. You'll learn a little bit about that in Module 6, is where you talk about the teams and the roles.
I'm going to do mute. I'm not sure if it's the line or if it's something, but we're getting some noise. So let me do a star 78. And Steve, I think once I do that, you need to do a star 6 to unmute yourself. So let me do a star 78, and you do a star 6.
All right.
All participants are now in listen-only mode.
Steve, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but it should be a star 6.
Yes,
Yep.
I did star 6. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve.
All right. Are there any other questions at the moment to go on?
I'll interrupt if there are, but I say go.
You'll let me know? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Next slide, please.
Much quieter.
Then,
Thanks, Steve.
is that better? Okay. So, and then besides talking about the basic concepts, then, we'll talk to the class about, okay, what needs to be installed, what are the installed elements. So part of it, basically, you can install an Urbancode Deploy server, which has the web interface, administrative part, and user operations. It has the connection for, LDAP integration. You can set that up. System administration. There's also the orchestrates that integration with all the other elements. On each target that you're going to deploy to, you need to install what's called an agent. Okay, and that provides the communication between that target and the server, where the steps are actually executed. And that's accomplished with what we call plugins. And if you go to the site, which is ibm.net, ibmdw.net/urbancode, you'll see a menu there for all our plugins. There's about 115 plugins currently at the moment. Those are the integrations with their various platforms that are there. But most of those plugins are built around a Groovy library, but they can be written in other formats, and you could actually create other plugins. And if a plugin doesn't exist for if it's missing functionality or that you want to do, you can there's also a shell script both for Ant, Ant and shell script and I think it's PowerScript. I forget the name of that particular one. Then the other element besides the deploy server and the agents, there's also optionally you can install what's a relay server, relay agent relay is really what it's called. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Next slide. So then I'd go through and show the elements from the user interface, just to talk briefly about them. The dashboard is the first menu, each of these menu items. If you've got a process you want to go ahead and for some reason you want to kill the process, that's where you go to the dashboard, where you define the components and the application, those menus there. You can look at the various configurations. I would focus initially in showing them. Normally, I don't have connection. I would normally go through and show this in the tool itself, and I kind of walk them through these menus and just go through each one and talk about it. I think that's more effective than just showing the slide, but for now I'm just going to show the slide here. And talk about the resources, and there's the ability to do on-demand when you do a deployment by saying, I want to go ahead and deploy this, but you can also schedule it through the calendar. Next slide. So as an example, throughout the course, we're going to use a web application called JPetStore. Now, we use that because it's kind of an application they can get their mind around. It's a simple application, but it illustrates how Urbancode works and some of the benefits when you actually use it, but you actually see it in place. So, so we talk about a web application, but it could be other types of applications. It could be an SOA application. It could be message queue. It could be message broker type applications and so forth. Like I said, for the example for the class, we use a web application to demonstrate it. So because it shows different groups that are used, they have different schedules as far as creating their piece of the component. So the web application is just 3-tier. We have web pages or content that get deployed to the web server. We have the execution logic. Usually the programmers are doing that. That's the WAR files or the jar files to get deployed that did the work, and then the database server, the database structure for that. So go to the next slide.
Steve, just a question before you leave that slide. Can UCD be used for Oracle products like Oracle DB, WebLogic, Oracle EBS, etc.?
So for database, there's the plugins we have. There's an Oracle Plus plugin. There's also Oracle JDBC, so you need to do the Oracle JDBC connection. I should say SQL JDBC connection, or you can use Oracle. So it supports both Oracle and DB2 and SQL Server, the databases that we support for the product. As far as deployment to, you can really go to any kind of database that will support a JDBC connection, or if you use an Oracle, you use the Oracle Plus plugin.
And people can write their own plugin as well.
And they can write their own plugin if they were to use it. But those are the ones that we currently have. There might be some other plugins for the database. I haven't looked recently for the ones that are out there. I know someone had developed, I thought maybe one of the third parties had developed a Liquibase plugin to do it through Liquibase as another way to go through a database. So
I have one other question.
Yeah.
Would the installation be available as a container, or is there a way to leverage containers?
Can you explain a little bit further? You're talking about, well, let me talk a little bit about what the architecture is here. Maybe this will clear up the question.
Okay.
If not, then let me know. Maybe you can elaborate on that a bit. So for the lab environment, what we have is we actually do it with one server. But this could be multiple servers. But in our case, we use one server. But on that server, we have installed, it's a Linux. It's got Urbancode Deploy server installed on it, which has an embedded Tomcat. That's basically the underlying technology on the web server for Urbancode Deploy. And then we have installed in there MySQL instance, and we have it Urbancode Deploy agent. So that's what's on the server. And then we also on that server is we have 2 instances of Tomcat installed, which would be we have one that represents the SIT environment and one that represents the UAT environment. Okay, next slide. So the basic flow, and this is what you'll go through in the lab workbook, is that you're going to create resources. Once you get the resources created, you're going to add the agents that resource, create the components. You add the versions of the components. You'll add the component process for the components. And you'll do this for the lab. You'll do all this for the lab. So this is just the basic workflow of setting up the environment. Now, once you've set it up, if you have multiple environments you want to deploy to, you just got to create new resources and install the agents, and then you just drop the components on there, and they can deploy to those also, or map them to those components. Next slide. Did you move to the next slide? Okay. So when you get done with the lab, okay, you're going to have, so we saw earlier how things were set up. It'll actually, the deploy will actually deploy an app, which is basically deploying a jar file on Tomcat. It'll deploy the database, SQL statements to create the database, and it'll actually deploy the web content of this JPEG store. And we do that both for SIT and the UAT environments. So I don't know, hopefully that answered, did that answer the person's question about the container? And maybe it's just I'm not just familiar with that particular terminology.
Yeah, we can go back to it later.
Okay.
The other thing, too, Steve, is that basic workflow that we cover in the class is also what a typical user would do in real life, according to what our user experience team has determined is a basic workflow in a company.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So that's basically talks about the lab and how the lab set up and structured. Can you go to the next slide? So now different groups are going to use different component versions. Okay, in development you'll probably use the latest of everything. In the QA, when you have a candidate release, there's certain versions you're going to use of those components. You won't use all those components that deploy to the QA environment. And then for the production environment, there's going to be ones that are proven, tested, and working. So, and now I lost my I lost the slide deck. What happened there, Lou?
Yeah, I think, Joanne, we've lost your screen.
Oh, Joanne's hosting it?
Yeah, she's sharing the slides. Joanne, all we see is a black screen. There you go. So you're good now.
Yeah.
You want to full screen that?
So, yeah, so the next slide, Joanne? So Urbancode Deploy allows us to give either engineers or anybody who's in the deployments, they can decide which pieces go to what environments depending on what access they have, depending on their role. So for example, the development environment, usually development people, folks who belong to that role will be able to deploy there. And they'll pick the versions they're using, where the QA, people that have the ownership of the QA environments will deploy there in the versions they want, and the same thing for production. Usually we'll have an operations folks doing the production environment. So, next slide. So the basic topology or architecture of Urbancode Deploy, it's a three-tier architecture. We have a client level, which is a browser when you install the Urbancode Deploy server. There's also optionally, if you go to the tool menus, you can also install what's called the Urbancode Deploy client, which allows you to do command line access to the server. And then there's agents that are installed, and they're going to be installed on the target machines. Optionally, if you want to install what's called an agent relay, so for example, if you have different data centers, you may want to have an agent relay installed in each of the data centers, and then the agents installed to those relays. And one of the advantages of using the agent relays from 6.1 on is it also cache the downloads there. That's one of the advantages of using it if you're having multiple data centers. And then the other thing too is that you may have different firewall, and you only want to have to open a port for the relay. You don't have to. If you have a number of different agents, you don't have to open the port. You can just open one port for the relay, and and then connect all the agents there. So that's the purpose of it. And then the data tier level, which is of course the database that Urbancode Deploy's data is stored in. As I mentioned, it's DB2, it's SQL Server, and Oracle. And I just lost my picture. Okay. I lost the picture there, Joanne. Can you re-share it?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
I see it here. It may be your connection.
Okay. I did see it a second ago. There we go. I see it now. If you can go to the next slide, please, number slide 34.
There's about a 4-second lag time.
Okay. So the key elements are, we're talking about what components are. So these are the main elements that are represented in the model, I guess, the key elements of the Urbancode Deploy. So, you know, the components that pieces your applications, as I mentioned, they represent your WAR file or your SQL files or a set of content. The application, it's a collection of those components and deployed together. Then you have your resources, which are the targets for deployment. And there's an agent on each host machine. And you can have multiple targets on the same box, but that's exactly how we're setting up for the lab is we have 2 different resource targets on one box, one for the SIT environment and one for the UAT environment. The environment is basically a collection of resources or computers that are going to be on the application. And then we'll talk about snapshots in a minute, but a snapshot is a collection of specific versions that you're going to, version components that you want to deploy. The process is what actually the steps that operate to deploy the component. Those steps are executed on the agent. So when you're running it, the command is, you'll see it on the server side in the workflow, but the actual step when it's executed actually executes on the agent itself in the target box. And therefore, and there's 2 sets of processes that we'll talk about. There's, like as I mentioned, there's the application process, which is the orchestration, and then there's the component process, which does the actual deployments or other types of processing we've written, say for validation tests and things like that. And then there's the plugin. Plugins themselves, another key element that provides facilitates the integration with the various platforms. And as I mentioned, there's probably around 115 or so automation plugins that we have on our site. Next slide. When we get done, I'll take any questions after this too. So some of the benefits of this Urbancode Deploy, the automation, one thing is you get visibility of this automated control of the application process. You're able to manage your applications and components. You can also manage configurations, so all the environments. You see what's the display here is we have an environment called dev. There's a QA there. Inside that, you see what's called the inventory, which shows you the components that were deployed and the version of those components and whether it was successfully deployed or not. That's the compliant. You can also, there's a view request in each one of those. If you want to see exactly how that thing was deployed, you can select the view request. You can drill down and see each step that occurred and look at the log for each of those steps. There's also secure self-service capabilities, meaning that you can deploy on demand by selecting the play button there to record it. And if you have permission if you're in the role that has permission to deploy for that environment, then you can deploy. That's going to be by secure. So it's increased the transparency and also ensure governance and compliance. So one of the things that any changes you make in the system is recorded as a change, and each of the objects will have like a change menu, and you can see what's been changed. The version is the process, both the application process and the component processes are versioned. So every time they make a change, and who made those changes. So from an audit perspective, they can see that. A number of customers in various regulatory type environments like Urbancode Deploy, because it's easy for them to help them with passing audits. Next slide. So those are some of the main benefits of the process. And there's a standard way, too, of doing your deployments. Instead of having a bunch of scripts all over, there's a standard mechanism and framework for doing those deployments. And this is just showing the inventory. There's a compare between 2 different, you want to see what the difference is between 2 different environments, in the SIT and UAT environment. You can compare, and see what's different as far as the component versions there to there. Next slide.
Steve, a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One is that, so you have a scenario where a customer has 2,000 Windows servers. You would need a UCD agent for each of the 2,000 servers. Here is when the agent relay helps. Question mark, please clarify.
So the agent relay, that would be good if you have that many agents or servers out there. You could segment them. That would reduce the load on the web server for sure. In that case there, we do have, by the way, we have customers that have. I know one customer that's got like 3,000 agents that are running, and I think they have maybe 4 or 5 relays that they divide that up among. So hopefully that answered the question there.
Second question, if a customer has a hybrid targets across a different cloud service provider or on premises, for example, will we be able to support that mixed environments and remote?
Yeah, we'll be able to support that as far as the deployments. There is another tool called Urbancode Deploy with patterns, which basically integration with cloud service. OpenStack's one of them. Do you know the other ones, cloud services we support with the Urbancode Deploy with patterns?
It's Amazon and VMware.
Right. So you basically define, you can provision for each of those types of environments.
Great. Thanks.
Okay. Snapshots. So a snapshot is, normally you take a snapshot after you've done a set of testing, right? So you've tested your group of components that represent this application. Going back to our example, we have a database component, a web component, and the core code or the WAR file component, right? And then after you've tested it, you want to take a snapshot of that so you can deploy that as a unit. So that's where snapshots come in. And it not only takes a snapshot of the version of the component, it will also take a snapshot. When you take that snapshot, it will also record what version of the process was used for each of those components, what the properties were also used, the property versions, so that when you can do is once you take that snapshot, you can promote that from one environment. For example, you go into SIT to UAT. You can use the snapshot to do the promotion, and it'll actually deploy it to that other environment as a unit. So, next slide. So just briefly talking about the relationship between components, applications, and snapshots. So an application is a collection of components. So here we have, a WAR, a jar, and a database component. Those are different components that make up this particular application. And then, over time, we've got different versions for each one of those components, and the snapshot allows you to define, at a certain time when you've done your testing, this set of versions for these components, I can deploy it based on a snapshot. And you can record a snapshot too, and you can go ahead and modify it if you wanted to. You can also lock the snapshot when you get to production level. But if you want to make one change in everything else is the same except for like new one component, you want a different component, you can change each one of the versions in there in that snapshot. Next slide. So that slide just basically covers the relationship between those three. And then the next one talks about resources and then how these resources relate to environments. Basically a set of resources, which basically resources are usually looked at from the perspective of operations or the infrastructure team that sets them up, right? Whether those resources are hard machines or they're virtual machines or someplace in the cloud. And then the resources are logical targets that are there. The environment could have multiple servers and select a particular place in the resource tree where it's going to represent an environment for SIT or UAT environment. And then there's the processes that execute actually on the box. the application process and the subset, its component process.
What do you think, Steve, is the key differentiator to help people recognize the difference between the resource and the environment, for the terms?
Well, I think it's the resource, let's just say environment is a collection of resources for a particular application deploying. And the resource is from the perspective of the infrastructure team, which actually sets up these resources. Usually it's a different group that actually will set the machines up versus the group that's going to be deploying it. So they'll be assigned a certain set of resources in the environment, and then they'll be assigned for a particular application a certain set of resources for testing, for system integration testing, for UAT testing, and for production. And the environments represent each one of those particular areas, those systems.
Okay.
Next slide. Yeah, one environment has multiple resources, correct? Yes, you can have one environment that has multiple resources. So, for example, you can have an environment, say the SIT environment, and say you have, for example, I had a customer that had, last year, they had 10 different system integration test environments that they used. And each one of those environments had, I think, 7 or 8 machines in them because it was a SOA application. So they had a database server, and I think they were using WebLogic, and they had different pieces of their application, the components. So there were multiple resources in each one of those environments. Can a resource be in multiple environments? Yes, a resource can be in multiple environments. Okay. Process editor. So when we talk about the how, we set our process up as using the process editor, which is allows us to select steps in here. Here we're talking about this is a component process. Allows us, for example, download artifacts, and maybe we want to decide we can have logic in our process too. There's a switch statement or a switch step that allows us to define. Maybe have a particular property we want to test on. We can use that. There's also the ability to go a particular path depending if the step passes or fails, and you can specify by clicking on the actual checkbox, check icon there, whether it'll toggle between success, failure, or don't care. What is an example of resources in multiple environments? Let me think about that. Next slide. So the process editor is where we write our workflow. That's the how, basically, in the tool. And you can parameterize that, because when you write your process, you want to write it such that it'll work for any environment. So that way, and the way you're able to do that is we talk about properties, and we'll get into properties in I think the resource module. Is that right, Joanne? Is that where we talk about properties? I forget which module it's in. Let's see. And then there's a set of review questions that asking what a component is, what a resource is, what a snapshot is, and go through this with your class. Someone had a question about Sarah O'Connor, I guess, was some question on a common resource used across. I don't understand that question. Or someone just, oh, you're having a discussion, I'm sorry. I thought there was a question. All right.
Steve?
Next slide. Yes.
Sure. You asked about the module, I think, we have a separate module on resources.
Yeah, which module are we covering? I think the properties, is it covered in the resource module or component? I'm not sure where we cover the types of properties. Do you know which module that's in?
Yeah, I think that might be more towards like applications, I think. I'm not
Okay.
sure. But the resources module, I think, might cover it a little bit too. Some things are covered
Yeah.
in more than one module.
Right.
If they were, yeah.
So there's a set, and we haven't talked on the introduction here, but there is a set of properties so that when you write your process, you'll write it with parameters so that you can write it. It'll be independent of what environment, and then you can use these properties to get resolved at deployment time, because they're stored, and usually the values are stored in Urbancode Deploy.
Mm-hmm.
Next
You
slide.
know, it may be that
Go ahead.
people were answering the questions in the discussion.
Yeah, no, they I saw that. Okay, so then normally what I do at this point is I'll do I don't have my display set up, and I was just going to talk through this, but I normally do a demonstration to show a simple deployment. And what I do is when you get to the lab, if you complete Lab 4, at the end of Lab 4, you deploy a database, you deploy a database version and the web content, right? I'll usually deploy that. First of all, we'll go into the SIT environment and show the JPEG Store website and the differences. And usually, if you look at that website in there, it basically, when we after get them deploying 1.1 version of database and web, we have a new dog product in there. I think there's 5 products, and when you're done, you get 6 you get to Bashan. So you normally demonstrate that. You'll show that for the class.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also do the video. I think we have a video for this, right?
Yep.
You did mention there's a video for this. So you don't necessarily have to do the demonstration. But if you wanted to demonstrate it yourself, then that's normally what I do is I'll go to the end of Lab 4. You know, that's my starting point. You can take a snapshot in your VMware image. And then do the last part of Lab 4 where it deploys version 1.1 of the database and the web. And then in Lab 5, you'll show how you take a snapshot and you promote that to UAT. And then in between, you show the actual deployment and see how long it takes. It doesn't take very long. It's a few minutes, a minute or so to deploy it. And then actually go to the actual application in Tomcat, and you'll see it running. And that's what I like about JPEG Store. It's a simple little example when people are trying to grasp the tool to begin with. It helps them because later on they'll get more complex as far as how they're going to use it. So it's a nice simple example where they grasp the concepts, and I've found this over the last couple of years in teaching the course and mentoring folks that having this baseline at the beginning of doing that lab is really important. Next step, or next slide. And then this last section talks about just the elements in the web user, and I think one of the things that the customers or clients have initially, until they start navigating around, is a navigation through. Can we just go through this kind of slides kind of quickly? And normally I'd probably actually do this in the tool, but we have it here on the web session. But I would focus initially on the resources, the components, and the applications. Those are the main elements of the product, right? So that you get that for navigation purposes, just start with that. Go to the application and show an application, go to JPEG Store to go to the next slide. And then if you select the applications menu, you'll get your list of applications. And here in this case, we just got one. So we select JPEG Store, and you select that. And then there's actually sub-menus for JPEG Store there. And there's where we set our configuration for the components that are part of that application, and then the application process, and where we get our snapshots, the snapshot menu. So those are the ones I would focus on initially to help them with their navigation. You drill into those. Next slide. And then talk about navigation back. You can use the breadcrumbs at the top there. That's always good for navigation. So lots of different links there to get through to navigate around. Next slide. And then I usually show them the process editor. This particular one is the application process. So we're looking at the JPEG Store deploy process. And over on the left there, as far as the step palettes, basically installing and uninstalling components and rollback and then utility steps and kind of go through there with them on that. Next slide. And then look at the results. You can see whether a component, if a process failed, we'll see if it's compliant. So the inventory, the way that works is that you have your version of your component there. That's the desired version you requested to deploy. And if it fails, then it'll show in red there if it's out of compliance. Okay. In this case here, we actually have version 1.0 and then 1.1, an incremental version of the database. Next slide. And then when we talk about the Urbancode's code station, that's the artifact repository. And I like to keep that separate from, or distinguish that between an artifact repository and a source code repository. The artifact repositories are the results of a build, whether you're packaging up a set of content for a web, or it's a compilation of a EXE file that you're going to deploy. That's the location of where those deployable assets are kept, and as part of the pipeline, you may push that from the build environment to the build system to CodeStation. The other repository is a source configuration, which is usually where you're going to have your source code deposited to be used for development purposes. So there's a lot of similarities between both. But just I like to distinguish between the two. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see why I do that. I think the next slide's got the, yeah. So the continuous delivery pipeline, this is the kind of, if you want to go to a continuous delivery, we do, CI, continuous integration, and continuous delivery, then this is the pipeline you kind of want to follow. After you're done with you check into your SCM system, they'll use a build system, whether it's Jenkins or RTC build engine or BuildForge or some other build environment. They'll go ahead and build it, and then they'll push that package in the package repo or the artifact repository. From that point there, it's in CodeStation, and from CodeStation, Urbancode to deploy it. It's not required to go back to any of the other systems to pull what it has to deploy if it's actually a component that's put into the repository. Okay, next step.
So when we say package repo, we mean CodeStation.
Yeah, I would need to change the slide a little bit. I think I want to make it match we mean CodeStation or the artifact repository. There's an SCM repository versus an artifact repository.
Yeah.
I like to distinguish between the two in that pipeline. I think that helps to clarify things when we're getting new concepts across people.
Plus, they might not use CodeStation, but most of them use CodeStation. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. And the next couple of slides just talk about the agent and how the agent works, because questions should come on that. The agent's a lightweight process that gets installed in the target. There's two-way communications. It's stateless, and it's usually installed by default as SSL. So you can install it not, but I would recommend that you do SSL. And then it's built on top of Java, and you got to have the JVM version 1.7 or greater. Is CodeStation optional? It can be, but I would recommend using CodeStation. There's a lot of advantages to it. One that I mentioned about, especially if you're going to use relays, because if you're going to use relays, you're going to get that caching capability that you wouldn't normally get. Next slide. The agent process basically that runs is actually two processes that run. These lightweight processes is called the worker process and the monitor process. Next slide. Typically, or what happens is in the communications is the I'll wait till you go to the next slide. I think it's on the next slide.
Server agent communication.
Pardon me?
On server agent communication?
Yeah, server agent communication. So basically, when you, in each of the steps, as the steps go down, it'll actually execute those steps on the agent, and it's communicated through JMS, the JMS channel, and then when it needs to download something, it'll go through HTTPS. By default, it's going to be HTTPS. That's basically how the files get translated. So what's nice about using this is that getting the files over there are all done in CodeStation. Yeah, by the way, CodeStation is part of the product. It comes with it. There's no option. There's no additional cost. Okay. Next step. Or next slide, I mean. Next step in the process, right? So, and then, simple configurations, you don't have all, you use an agent directly, you can just install the agent, but in more complex situations, kind of your, if we've got an enterprise type situation where you have, multiple data centers and so forth, or between departments you have firewalls, and then you can optionally use the agent relay to solve those kind of things. Depending on what your network topology is. There's a lot of flexibility as far as architecting your topology for use of Urbancode Deploy. Next step, or next slide.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so this example of using the agent relay, and it's just that the agent relay has, you only have to open one port. It's just for the relay itself, and then all the agents connect to the relay. But if you had directly to the agent, and you had a lot of, between each department had its own firewall, you'd have to open a port for each one of those agents. So, anyways, next slide. So that kind of just to summarize, we kind of went over what the problems Urbancode Deploy helps to solve as far as deployments. You didn't really mention, but the other thing besides doing deployments with Urbancode Deploy and rollbacks and things like that, you can also, when you're done with your deployment, you could actually you can create processes that run validation tests, right, and integrate with things like test type integrations. I'm trying to think, what's this? Selenium is one. They wanted to run some test after it's done, or maybe do a smoke test or some validation. You can have other processes and set statuses on the versions and so forth, and use that as a gate between environments.
Doesn't it integrate with other testing tools, though? It's not really a testing tool itself?
No, it's not really a testing tool, but it'll kick off a test for you automatically. So anything you want to automate as part of your deployment, when you're done with the deployment, you may want to run some automated test on that deployed application, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It'll help kick those off using some other tool.
Yep. So the workflow for the basic time of the workflow that plays the deployment. We talked about the snapshots inventory, looked at user navigation, talked a little bit about the topology and the server agent communications. So this is what covered just high level in Module 1. So are there any other questions we have? Let's see, I'm looking at the chat window. On ZOS world, the code station is on a US, not on a, someone answering that question? Looks like someone's answering that question. Oh, okay. All right. How does Urbancode compare to Puppet? Someone asked that question. Puppet allows you to, I think, to automate, and there is a community plugin for Puppet so you can integrate with Puppet. What's nice about Urbancode, the differentiator is that it's the orchestration, the ability to orchestrate what those, you have to do a lot of scripting, is my understanding, to do the orchestration with the Puppet. You can still use Puppet if you want to do the actual, say for example, you're going to install middleware or some sort, and you want to use Puppet or Chef. I know we have a integration with Chef also. And then, so the differentiator is that the orchestration, the application level process, since we have a two-level process, it's orchestrating what order things get deployed. That would be the difference. It's a question for Joanne.
Okay, let me go.
Oh yeah, so David's got some more comments about that. It doesn't have the concept of environments or inventory.
Oh, okay. There was a question about, for trainers, are there slide notes or a separate trainer doc with talking points? Yes, there are slide notes, and those are designed to help you teach to the slide. It's not exactly scripted, I wouldn't say. That's one of the reasons why we're doing this session. This will be recorded. And then anything else for me?
I don't think so. I think David responded, by the way, the other difference between Puppet and Chef. He was saying that, yeah, it doesn't have a concept of environments or inventory. So, and that's one of the key things, that visibility to know what's been deployed where. And then if you look at the review request record, everything that's deployed is really easy to go through and step. Unfortunately, I'm not set up right now to do that, but if you've used the tool, I'm assuming the people on this call, or some of the people on this, the majority of people on this call have used Urbancode Deploy. I don't know how many people are new to it. How many of you, I think, just raise your hand, are new to Urbancode Deploy? It's kind of the first time you've had an introduction to it, or seen anything. Yeah, so there's also, besides this, there's also I don't know if you want to talk about self-enablement materials. Is that something that we're going to provide? They'll let them know in the course after they're done if they want to kind of review. Because as Joanne mentioned, there's videos out there on the microsite, ibmdw.net/urbancode. You'll see a tab there called Videos. There's also the Learning Center. I'm sorry, Learning Circle, DevOps Learning Circle. And that address is, I'll show the shortcut to everybody in here.
Yeah, we should probably put a list of resources. Yeah, resources.
Additional resources. So if you go to ibm.co/DevOps Learning Circle, that's a shortcut for it. You can go to that website, and you can see the Learning Circle, which has on the right the number of videos. There's actually an activity you can run through. I mean, Lou, do you want to talk about this? It's kind of your area too. So if you have any comments on it.
We have a learning circle on DeveloperWorks, as you mentioned, Steve, and it's made to. There's a learning program that you go through, take action items. There's a workshop for Deploy. There's a workshop for a plugin lab, how to build a plugin for Deploy. And there's a workshop for the release product as well, and so you can go through all of that material and cursor to those workshops and look at the videos, etc.
Mm-hmm.
You can get driven through on the Learning Circle on the right there. There's a set of links. They'll take you to the microsite, but if you want to go to directly, there's the ibmdw.net/urbancode, which has the microsite, and in there you'll find these are resources that let your folks know that you're teaching. That there's a menu for the plugins. They find all the plugins that are available that you can download. There's also a forum that's being monitored by Urbancode developers if you have a question. And this is outside support, so the response may not be as quick as support, but my understanding is that the developers are pretty active out there answering questions. And there's a nice search capability to answer it. There's also a set of, under Docs menu, I think there's some tips, there's some various webinar articles and things on using Urbancode Deploy, various applications of it. I'm trying to think what else. I don't know if you want to show it, Lou, that site. I'd show it if I could, but I can't right now because I can't display share my screen. The microsite, IBM. So the question is, are any plans for UCD with patterns to support native soft layer CCIs? That's a good question. I think we'll have to take that offline and find out. I don't know. Do you know, Lou, on that answer, the question on that? About soft layer? That'd be a good question for the forum. Put that question out of the forum, let the developers and see on that.
Yeah, I'll do that. We'll post answers. We'll post this whole chat on a blog, internal blog post that we have that announced this session, and then also we'll get it out to the business partners as well.
Mm-hmm. The other thing is, I think maybe, Steve, one of the resources you mentioned may also be referred to as the dev-to-dev site. And that's a heavily used site on Urbancode Deploy. It's got a lot of great information, and I'm going to have a separate page on that site for the training material, explaining that you can get training from the partners, and linking to the material on the Learning Circle, as well as in the course material vault.
That's great.
Yep. So we'll have to keep that up to date, you know. And then in terms of the videos, where we had a slide in this product overview about the deployment demo, the video of that, if you're teaching this and you are not able to actually do the demo yourself, you can show. There's a video that was recorded by Eric Minnick doing the deployment. It takes a little while to run that video, but you can, as long as you can link directly to YouTube, you don't even have to have the video local. So that's assuming you have an internet connection. You know, maybe we should provide the videos locally if you want to run the videos.
You have the link inside the courseware, so as an optional thing if they want to run it, as opposed to, yeah, you could do that. That'd be nice in the slide.
I put the link in the slide notes, so the instructor could link from the slide notes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Brad's asking, what's next? I don't know, Joanne. What's next in the?
That's a good question. Okay. The next Train the Trainer session has not been scheduled, you're right, and I do want to schedule the next session to go over the resources module, okay? And the resources module has a pretty simple lab, so I think what we're going to do is demo the lab. I'll do a little demo of the lab and show you a little bit how you do that first resources lab. We won't be able to have everybody do the lab unless everybody's internal, but I think a lot of people will have, you know, well, depending on where you are in your learning process, you can do the lab on your own if you want, but we'll do a little demo of the resources lab and go through the resources slides, same sort of thing as this. So if you are from a GTP, okay, if you're from one of our global training providers, that's Avnet, Arrow, LearnQuest, Global Knowledge Network, or Ingram Micro, can you raise your hand and put your hand down if you're not from one of those places? Okay, so we have two people here from, looks like one person's from LearnQuest. I'm not sure where Kevin Conway is from, but anyway, that's great. We have our training partners, a couple of people who will be teaching the class from the training partners. So Kevin Conway's from GK, Global Knowledge, so that's good. The lab assets, everything will be packaged together in the course. So if you have access to the course material vault, you need special access to that. Everything will be packaged together as a zip file you just download from the course material vault. If you don't have access to the course material vault, then everything will be accessible from the Learning Circle. And some of this actually can be done self-study, too, especially if people can access these recordings that we're doing of each module. You could certainly do this self-study if you want.
Yeah, the Learning Circle actually has the activity in the order to do those. I don't know, have those been updated, Lou, as far as using the newer recordings and stuff, and the instructions on the activities?
We're regularly updating the Learning Circle with materials, but a new update is coming to update, for example, the Deploy workshop to reflect the latest version of the product. I believe it still is reflecting Urbancode 6.0. Needs to be updated to 6.1.1, etc.
Yeah, and that's helpful to learn it as far as the steps going through that. Typically, when I do engagements, they have an option to either do it on, do it on site, do a training, more formal training class, or we actually, sometimes they want to do it on their own. I'll have them do self-enablement, and then I'll have like a 3 or 4 hour session for questions and answers. But that's usually pretty effective too. So
yeah, so I think
depends on what
this.
the customer wants.
Yeah, I think we could do this virtually, don't you, Steve? Do this as a virtual. Yeah. Yep, the training providers could do virtual sessions. The other thing that I figured out as I was developing this was with the JPet Store example. We use this. This is kind of the key example that's used for enablement purposes, for internal training purposes here at IBM. So you'll see this JPet Store stuff, I call it, in a lot of places. You'll see it on the YouTube videos. It's like, okay, JPet Store, that's familiar. So, you'll see the same sort of stuff in different places, okay? There's going to be probably little different versions of the same sort of thing. Good old JPet Store, yep.
Yeah. I think the reason is I like to use it's a simple example because then we can get to more complex ways of things you're deploying depending on your technology you're deploying to. But this gets without it, when they're first learning the tool, this is the reason why we use a simple example like this. And they actually get a real thing they're deploying to a website. So, my experience in working with customers the last couple of years, I find this really helpful.
I think it's a good example. Lou, what about, do we have any other examples used in some of the work you've been doing?
Yeah, we have, there's a POT that has the money that matters example. So that's that's more expansive than the workshop. It has Jenkins in it, and it's got a testing tool in it as well, briefly, but it's focused on deploy, and it uses money that matters.
Right, it shows all those integrations, and the thing is, when they're first learning the tool, the basic concepts is things in the concepts for them, and then they can do things like that, or what we typically do is after we do this, we'll actually do a workshop style and go in our customer's environment and work with them with their application. But it level sets them with the basic concepts. They understand basic benefits and concepts, and then now we make it real in their environment with their particular application. So, but if you don't have that back, I've gone to a customer before and they just wanted to jump right into it without any kind of training. I told them, at least watch the video, we didn't do that. And by the end of the week, can we have a training class? And then after we do the training class, oh, then now I get it, right? So, and having this JPET really helps. So.
And I would also know one more thing, where there is also a workshop that uses JPET Store, but it's based on release with deploy. And we have some.
Yeah, that's a great. That one's on the Learning Circle too. I don't know if that's on the Learning Circle or not. Is that one available for? I know internally it is, but that's the one we gave at Innovate last year, and I've used that with a customer, and it was great to teach. It was a one-day to teach them about Urbancode release and how it integrates with Urbancode Deploy. It worked out really well.
So that is also, that's on the Learning Circle? available to business partners and customers as well. The image is not, you'd have to build the image.
Mm-hmm. And Michael Verga says, are there plans to develop any courseware on some more advanced topics other than the plugin development? And yes, that has come up. We may not have an official course, but we want to continue packaging things as modules so that, for instance, if you wanted to customize a course, you have some optional pieces that you might be able to add in for customers. I know, Steve, when you've taught this, when you've worked with customers, everybody's a little bit different in terms of what they want. So this is the fundamentals. That's where we are at this point for version 6.1. We'll need to keep this course updated as we have new releases. I'm not sure how often we're going to update it yet. But if you have feedback on topics that you get questions on from customers that's important that we need to cover, please let us know.
Hi, this is Mike. There's like component processes, a little bit more depth. Customers are asking for a little bit more depth maybe on some of the WAS-specific component processes or IIS component process, that type of thing. Rollback, customizing the course to do a rollback during demo. Things like that. Those are simple things that we could probably add to this course, things that we can add. And then Reggie and Wilbur are doing additional things for Z. So.
For what?
For ZOS.
ZOS? Okay. Yeah, also there's component templates too.
Oh yeah, right.
I've got an example, Joanna, can give you with regards to the rollback I actually did for another customer. They wanted to see that in the database, and we could add another lab or like 5, another lab in 5, section in 5 that shows that.
Oh, cool. Okay, good. All right, I'm going to put this stuff in one of our RTC work items so we don't lose track of it. The other thing, too, is in terms of the amount of time it takes to do this class. Steve, you've taught it. Do you have a sense of how long do you usually spend with the customer on the basics?
Usually, I've done it in a day and a half. And the half day basically is we cover through about 5. I kind of leave security for another day and other topics, administrative type topics, because they want to talk about security and process around that, and usually I'll leave that for the second day. So when I get done with that, then usually what I'll do with the customer is we'll do a workshop style and actually go on their environment and start implementing. They've got a particular canned application we've selected, and we'll start implementing in their environment. So that's once these basics have been taught. So, but usually a day to a day and a half. I mean, you could do it in a day, but I mean, if you want to talk about security and a couple other things around it, it just depends on the size of the class. If it's typically when I've taught it, I've had, this summer I had like one customer. I think taught 2 different groups. There were like 32 people, and we did. I think we did 3 days because it was a day and a half of Urbancode Deploy, and then half day on, or 2 days, I should say. I spent the day and a half Deploy, and then it's been a half day basically in their environment, and then also talked a little bit about just high level about Urbancode release. And I spent the 3rd day actually delivering. The Urbancode release one can be done, that workshop can be done in a day. I know that. Yeah,
I think we'll have a separate release class that we could offer together, deploy and release training. and that would probably be about 2 days. So it's good that we have the security, the teams and roles stuff at the end of the class, because if there like are no administrators in the group, that's probably something that we can you know, leave out, or if they only have the day, you know what I mean?
Right. If they have a day, they could possibly get through. It just depends on the size of the class. They could start early and do a full 8 hours. You could get through it. So
right.
It just depends on the level of, you know, they're just starting off from scratch and what have you. So that should be doable.
Yeah. Also, David says to all, Lou, Joanne, where can we get the training material, books, images? So the training material is already being published on the Learning Circle. There's a Learning Circle. You go to the IBM website and you search on Learning Circles. You go to the Urbancode Release and Deploy Learning Circle, and then you click on the Learning Roadmap. Learning Roadmap template, I believe. I put it there. It says the name of the course and the modules. I've started posting the modules there. And also the official course with the course number. That official course will be in what we call the course material vault. And if you're a training partner, you have access to that course material vault. If you're an internal person here, you probably don't have access to the course material vault unless you're in services. Does that answer that question from David? David who we have? Okay. And Reggie Barossa says that there are 2 PDFs that may help ZOS installs. Okay.
Yeah, there's been a number, actually there's been a couple of different POTs or that have been developed, various enablement organizations, you know, sales organizations inside that we've used. There's also one for that, who is it, Randy, I forget Randy's last name, developed for the WASMAC plugin that I've used. And this course here is the official course that we can allow for trainers if they requested. So that's, which is the basics. Those other ones are also how to apply this in usage. There's plans to develop usage guidance and videos and so forth when you go to, like, say, a particular plugin that you're using, say, for example, IAB or a message queue. You've got to write a document on a message queue that we want to eventually put out on the microsite, so when you go to the usage tab on the documentation, you'll see the information there. So.
So if there's not any other discussion or questions, I think we're getting close here to wrapping it up. Oh, sharing scripts. Not sure. Well, I think on jazz.net there are places to share scripts now. Yeah, I think there. I've heard about this, or maybe it's on DeveloperWorks.
Shared scripts. I assume you're talking about this community site. Is this where you're going? I'm not sure about these shared scripts. I know that there's a community project. I'm not sure how to get out of that from internally, but there's like a third-party project. If you go to the Urbancode Deploy microsite, IBM DW what is it, ibmdw.net/urbancode/plugins, you'll see there's categories of plugins, which are the ones developed by IBM. There's also third-party projects, and maybe that's what you're referring to. I don't know who you would contact to join. Let's see, if I go to the plugin site and I look at Urbancode Deploy plugins, I'm just going out there right now to take a look. If we can find something.
While you're looking for that, Steve, I believe David asked about the Learning Circle and finding the material on the Learning Circle under the course number, QQ147. So in terms of navigating the Learning Circle here, you got to click on Learning Roadmaps, which is one of the yellow stickies on the Learning Circle. And then under Learning Roadmaps, you go to Learning Roadmap Template, which is another yellow sticky. And you got to have a login. You have to have a developer work sign-in to access it as well.
That link I just put out there was for, like, for example, I went to the plugins page, I found 7zip. If you go to that plugin, it was built by the community, and if you click on that plugin and you, at the top, you'll see Visit Project. Now, I don't know how you get added to a project, but that's actually a DevOps service project for that plugin. And it says who the owner is and who the members are, I think, of that project. It's here's the other. Let me see if I can put this in the message window too. There's the link to the project itself, and yeah. So I don't know how you get into this project to add it, but apparently there's a plugin. There's an owner for this plugin, so it's built by the community. You said the question. You know, Lou, how you can.
I'm not sure. I am not sure.
Or maybe that's what you were referring to about sharing scripts. I don't know if that's what you were referring to in that question. That's what I was thinking was the community site that's there. There's one for Cloud Foundry, there's Clips. There's a bunch of them. Yeah, there's one there for Puppet too. There's a they're hosted on the Jazz Hub on the DevOps services site is where these are developed at, and that's the community. There's actually one for Liquibase out there too.
Raise your hand if you have done any development of education material on Urbancode, please. David? Michael? Sherry Stouffer? You're out there? There she is. This helps me in my development effort. Okay. Anything else? Any other comments, questions? Let's see. All right, thank you everybody for coming. There is no VMware image yet for this particular class. Like I said, you got to set up the lab environment in a cloud or create a VMware image using the lab setup instructions. Lou, do you have anything else to, any closing remarks, or Steve?
No, I don't have any. I dropped off before, but on the phone, I think I was talking to myself at one point, but hopefully this recording is all taken, and we'll make the recording available and put links to it on DeveloperWorks, and also get it out to business partners. Steve?
Great, thanks.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Joanne. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Joanne, if you relinquish presentation rights, I'll end the recording.
Oh, how do we do that? Okay.
I think I'd take it back.
Yep, I'm off.
And I am...